Okay, in the last class we have seen what is the pelvis and what are the dimensions of the pelvis. Today I'll be talking about how contracted pelvis causes cephalopelvic disproportion. See, these are the types of pelvis we have spoken about. One is the gynecoid pelvis, which is round in shape, and we have to look at the sacrum. The sacral angle, it is more than 90 degrees, and sacrum is well curved from above onwards and from side to side in a gynecoid pelvis. And in the cavity, we will see the sacrosciatic notch, which is this, and then the side walls of the pelvis. And here we will see whether the ischial spines are palpable or not, the interspinous diameter, intertuberous diameter, and the pubic angle. So we have seen how they are in each of the pelvis, in gynecoid, anthropoid, android, and platypeloid pelvis. Now these are the features which we have seen, and now what is the outcome in each of the parent pelvic types? In inlet, most common position in case of a gynecoid pelvis, what is the most common position? It is either occipitolateral or occipito-anterior. In case of gynecoid anthropoid pelvis, it is occipito-anterior or occipito-posterior, and in case of android, it is either occipito-lateral or occipito-posterior, and in case of platypeloid pelvis, it can be occipito-anterior. And what is the diameter of engagement? Here it is either the transverse diameter or the oblique diameter. And in case of anthropoid, it is anteroposterior diameter. Next, in case of android, it is either transverse or oblique and transverse diameter. So there is this complete table in your textbook which you can go through. Then next I am proceeding on to the etiology. The etiology of contracted pelvis. What are the causes which will lead to contracted pelvis? Either it can be nutritional or environmental defects. Minor variations are very common even in normal people, but major deficiency is the major changes are caused by rickets, which is deficiency of vitamin D in small children, and osteomalacia, which is deficiency of calcium. Or either diseases and injuries. Diseases are diseases of the pelvis like fractures, tumors, tubercular arthritis, etc. might cause, and any injuries of the spine leading to kyphosis, scoliosis, any coccygeal deformities, they all lead to contracted pelvis. Next are developmental defects, which are Naegeli's and Robert's pelvis. We will see that. What are Naegeli's and what are Robert's pelvis. Now, how does the pelvis look like in rickets? It is a disease. Rickets is a disease of early childhood, and bones, they are soft and non-ossified or unossified bones, and inlet, the sacral promontory is downwards, forwards, and the shape of the pelvis, the shape of the inlet is, see here, the shape of the inlet is reniform in shape like this, and there is shortening of the C here. The diameter of anteroposterior diameter is shortened, and the transverse diameter is very much increased here. Anteroposterior diameter is shortened, and in the cavity, the sacrum is flat and tilted backwards with a sharp, see here, there is a sharp sacrococcygeal angle. And outlet, there is widening of the transverse diameter of the outlet. This is the outlet from the lower border of the symphysis pubis to the tip of the coccyx. Here, the transverse diameter of the outlet is widened, and there is widening even of the pubic arch. Here, see, the pubic arch is also widened. Normal pubic angle is, subpubic angle is 85 degrees. It is more than 85 degrees. So this is how pelvis looks like in rickets. Now we will see how the pelvis looks like in osteomalacia. This is because of softening of the pubic bones, because of deficiency of calcium and vitamin D. It is seen in women who have reached maturity. The changes are, the sacral promontory is downwards and forwards. The lateral pelvic walls, they face inwards. Here you can see the lateral pelvic walls facing inwards. And the shape of the pelvis is triradiate in shape, like a triradiate shaped pelvis. And there is approximation of the ischial tuberosities here. This is one ischial tuberosity, this is one. There is approximation of this. The sacrum is shortened and coccyx is pushed forward. Next, asymmetrical or obliquely contracted pelvis. How do these look like? See, in Naegeli's pelvis, there is arrested development of one ala of the sacrum. On one side, the ala of the sacrum is absent. It is called Naegeli's pelvis. When it is absent on both the sides, it is called Robert's pelvis. On both the ala of the sacrum is absent, it is called Robert's, and on one side, one ala of the sacrum is absent, it is called Naegeli's pelvis. And this pelvis is contracted at all levels, but more at the outlet. In scoliosis, how does that look like? If the scoliosis involves the lumbar region, then there is deformity of the pelvis seen. The acetabulum is pushed inwards here, and it is obliquely asymmetrical pelvis with contraction of one or both oblique diameters of the pelvis. And in kyphosis, which we see in case of tuberculosis or rickets, we can see kyphosis, and extreme funneling of the pelvis is seen in case of kyphotic pelvis. Funneling means the anteroposterior diameter is increased, transverse diameter is reduced. Then we will see pelvis like funnel-like. And how does the mechanism of labor takes place in a contracted pelvis? In case of vertex presentation, see, the mechanism of labor is only possible in vertex presentation. In case there is a malpresentation, we don't usually give any trial labor. We directly go for cesarean section. So I'm telling you, I'm talking about mechanism of labor only in vertex presentation. So mechanism of labor is only seen in case of platypelloid pelvis. Platypelloid, the head finds difficulty in negotiating the brim of the pelvis. So there is only difficulty in negotiating the brim. Once it crosses the brim, then the cavity and outlet are adequate enough so that normal delivery will happen. So there is no difficulty faced while negotiating the cavity or the outlet of the pelvis. And now how does the head negotiate the brim of the pelvis? In the following manner, head engages with in the sagittal suture in the transverse diameter. This sagittal suture lies in the transverse diameter when the head negotiates the brim of the pelvis. And head will remain deflexed, like reflexed. Because of this deflection, engagement is always delayed. So if the AP diameter is too short, occiput is mobilized to the same side to occupy the sacral bay here. If the anteroposterior diameter is short, then occiput is mobilized so that it will occupy this sacral bay like this. See here, there is lateralization of the occiput to the sacral blade, to one side of the sacrum. And next, engagement. Engagement will take place by exaggerated parietal presentation. That is, the super subparietal diameter, which is 8.5 centimeters, will pass through the pelvic brim. So this is exaggerated parietal, where the parietal bones are overlapping over one another, even in this and even in this. And here it is the posterior parietal presentation. Here it is the anterior parietal presentation. In both of them, there is overlapping of the parietal bones. So it is called exaggerated parietal position. And here the diameter is shortened. It is super subparietal diameter, which is 8.5 centimeters, which will negotiate this brim of the pelvis. The next, extreme molding is seen with indentation or even fracture of one of the parietal bones. Once the head negotiates the brim, then there is no difficulty either in going through the cavity or the outlet, and normal mechanism of labor will follow. That is descent with internal rotation, and after internal rotation, there is birth of the head, and after head, there is restitution, next external rotation and birth of the shoulders, and next birth of the trunk by lateral flexion. So all this mechanism will take place in order once the head negotiates the brim. And generally in contracted pelvis, difficulty is felt from beginning of the labor to the end in a generally contracted pelvis. So the labor will give you indication at each stage of the labor. So how do you diagnose contracted pelvis? First, the incidence. So there is a gradual decline in severe degree of contracted pelvis, whereas there is improvement in the standard of living these days and better nutrition these days. Because of this, there is severe degree of contracted pelvis is reducing, and there can be contraction either in one diameter or only in one plane nowadays. So actual contraction like lacutic pelvis or osteomalacic pelvis, they are very rare. Now there is a term called fetopelvic disproportion. Nowadays we call it as fetopelvic disproportion because it is actually, if the pelvis is inadequate or there is a big baby or sometimes both of them. So that is called as fetopelvic disproportion. The pelvis may look adequate, but if the baby is big, then there is a difficulty faced by the baby negotiating the pelvis. So in that case, or when the pelvis is contracted in two diameters also, there is difficulty. So if there is any single factor, or sometimes both the factors might coexist. In such cases, we call it as fetopelvic disproportion. And how do you diagnose? Diagnosis always starts with past history. Then in the past history, you have to take a detailed medical history, whether the patient has any fractures, any vitamin D deficiencies in the past, like rickets. Now is the patient having any calcium or vitamin D deficiency? Whether the patient suffered from tuberculosis in the past, either of the pelvic joints or the spine, or any polio. So you have to take this medical history in detail. Next, you have to inquire about any injuries. Even the history of injuries should be asked. Next is obstetric history. In obstetric history, we have to inquire whether she had any previous uncomplicated, safe vaginal delivery of an average size baby. This will exclude contracted pelvis. But if the patient gives a history of prolonged tedious labor, so you have to inquire about all these things in obstetric history. Whether she had any previous history of prolonged tedious labor, which is followed either by spontaneous delivery or difficult instrumental delivery, it will indicate CP, or any history of difficult vaginal delivery with a stillborn baby, or if there is any early neonatal death, or the baby has any neurological stigma, then it also indicates that there is some problem with the pelvis. Next, any evidence of maternal injuries, like when the mother has any complete perineal tear, any vesicovaginal or ectovaginal fistulas following the delivery of the baby, even then it indicates contracted pelvis. And we have to inquire what is the weight of the baby, which is very, very important. If the baby is of average size and mother has any difficulty, then it indicates clear-cut case of contracted pelvis. But if the baby is big, then in the next labor, we can give her a trial labor in the next pregnancy. And what do you do on physical examination? You have to look at the stature of the mother. If the mother is short stature, that is less than 5 feet, then you can expect the mother to have a small pelvis. Then any deformities of the pelvic bones, hip joints, any deformities of the spine, you have to look for them. Whether she has any kyphosis, scoliosis, any spondylosis, or any other polio of the pelvic bones. You have to inquire about all these things. Next, there is a syndrome called dystocia dystrophica syndrome. What is this? The patient will present with, on general examination, patient is either obese, with stocky build, with a bull neck, broad shoulders, short thighs, and hirsutism. What is hirsutism? Hirsutism is male pattern of hair in a female. That is when she sports a mustache, or hair on the chin, hair in the midline of the body, over the chest, over the abdomen. This is called hirsutism. So if the woman has any hirsutism, if the woman is obese with stocky build, with a bull neck, broad shoulders, and short thighs, then we can see that then we have to look for other signs and symptoms, like she will be complaining of oligomenorrhea. Oligomenorrhea means, what is oligomenorrhea? When the period comes every more than 35 days. So she will be complaining of irregular periods, dysmenorrhea, and these patients are usually subfertile and they visit for fertility. So when the patient presents with all these problems, then we can clearly say that she is a clear-cut case of dystocia dystrophica syndrome. Now, how does the pregnancy take place in a woman with contracted pelvis? There is increased incidence of preeclampsia and tendency for post-maturity, and the pelvis is usually android type of pelvis, with occipito-posterior position being more common in these cases. And during labor, there is inertia, tendency either for deep transverse arrest or dystocia of the labor, with difficult instrumental delivery, or she might go for cesarean. So all these features will comprise of dystocia dystrophica syndrome. And now, on abdominal examination, what are the things you have to note when you do an abdominal examination? On inspection, if the woman is a preemie and she has a pendulous abdomen, then you can clearly see it is a clear-cut case of inlet contraction. In obstetrical with the primary, in case of a primary, there is engagement of head before the onset of labor in case of primary. But if there is any kind of malpresentation, you don't see this engagement of head. Then if there is a malpresentation, you can clearly see that if the head is not engaged before the onset of labor or if the woman has any malpresentation, then you can doubt for contracted pelvis. Now you have to do, how do you actually conclude? How do you diagnose it? By either clinical pelvimetry, and they are supported by imaging studies. So clinical pelvimetry is bimanual examination to diagnose contracted pelvis. And imaging studies are either we will do X-ray, radiopelvimetry, CT or MRI. So what is clinical pelvimetry? Clinical pelvimetry is we have seen a video of clinical pelvimetry, how we do that in the previous class. It is usually done once the woman completes 37 weeks, but it is better to do a clinical pelvimetry before the beginning of labor. What is the procedure? The woman should empty her bladder. She has to lie down in the dorsal position, and aseptic precautions are to be maintained while doing clinical pelvimetry. And even before that, you need to take the consent of the woman. You have to explain the procedure and take the consent of the woman. That is also important. Now, and in the procedure, what we see, we have to look at the state of the cervix. How is the cervix? What is the station of the presenting part in relation to the ischial spines? You have to test for CPD in a non-engaged head and note the resilience and elasticity of the perineal muscles, which is called the give of the pelvis. So these are all, these features are very, very important to note down when you do a clinical pelvimetry. So what are the steps you follow? You'll do an internal examination under complete aseptic precautions. You'll ask the woman to empty her bladder, lie down in dorsal position, take her consent, and do an internal examination. And in internal examination, what do you see? You look at the sacrum. The sacrum should be well curved from above below, and not only from above below, from side to side also. You have to look at the curvature of the sacrum, and it has to be accessible only up to lower 3 pieces. Beyond that, the sacrum is never accessible to you. You have to note the curvature from above downwards and from side to side. Next, we look at the sacrosciatic notch. What is the sacrosciatic notch? There is a sacrospinous ligament covering the sacrosciatic notch, and when you put 2 fingers on the ligament, the width is with 2 fingers can be placed easily on the sacrospinous ligament covering the notch. So if you can place 2 fingers easily on the ligament, then you can say that it is adequate. Next, the ischial spines. Next, you have to palpate both the ischial spines on either side. They're usually smooth and difficult to palpate. You normally cannot palpate the ischial spines, and you have to, like the person who showed the clinical pelvimetry, you have to put your fingers wide and place both the index and the middle finger on the spines. And you cannot normally, with the complete stretched index in the middle finger, you can never palpate the ischial spines. You can palpate only a single spine. In case you are able to palpate both the spines, it means that it is an android pelvis. It is an android pelvis. And if you can palpate them, it means they are encroaching the cavity and diminishing the space in the mid pelvis. Next is the iliopectineal lines. You have to note for any breakage in the iliopectineal lines, and see, this is how you will. This is how you are palpating for the ischial spines, and now you are looking for the iliopectineal line, and you have to note for any breakage in the pelvis, because if there is any breakage, the forepelvis is narrowed, which is the feature of android type of pelvis. Next is you have to, in the cavity, you have to look for the side walls. Side walls are not easily palpable unless they are converging. And where do you get converging side walls? They are seen usually in android type of pelvis. And the posterior surface of the symphysis pubis, it is usually smooth, well curved, and usually it is smooth and well curved. If there is any angulation or break, then it indicates the pelvis will be abnormal. And next you have to look for the sacrococcygeal joint. You have to look for the mobility and the presence of a hooked coccyx, and the pubic arch, whether it is round and accommodates the palmar aspects of two fingers. See, this is how you will look for the, this is how you will look for the pubic arch. It has to accommodate the palmar aspect of two fingers. Next, the diagonal conjugate. I have just told you how to look for the diagonal conjugate, where the two fingers are passed along the sacral curvature to reach the sacral promontory. Normally, you cannot palpate the sacral promontory, means that diagonal conjugate is adequate. If the middle finger fails to reach or touches it with difficulty, then it indicates it is adequate for an average size of head to pass through the pelvis. Next is the AP diameter of the outlet. You will measure the distance between the inferior margin of the symphysis pubis to the skin over the sacrococcygeal joint. This is the AP diameter of the outlet. Skin over the sacrococcygeal joint, that you have to measure, which will indicate the AP diameter. Next is the pubic angle. The inferior pubic rami are defined, and the angle, when how is the angle measured? By fully abducted thumb and the index finger. This is how you will measure fully abducted thumb and the index finger, like this. Can you see? Fully abducted, between your fully abducted thumb and middle finger. Then this is the usually subpubic angle, and this is 85 degrees. If it is narrowed, then it is measured by abducted middle finger and index finger. It is called, it means it is narrowed. Then the transverse diameter of the outlet you have to measure. How do you measure the transverse? That you have to make a fist, and these four knuckles should fit in between the two ischial tuberosities. Normal diameter, it is measured by placing the knuckles of a clenched fist between the ischial tuberosities. If they fit like this, it indicates here. You can see in this diagram, it will indicate that the transverse diameter of the outlet is also adequate. Now, X-ray pelvimetry. Now, in order to support your diagnosis, clinical diagnosis of a contracted pelvis, if you are doubtful, then you can go for X-ray pelvimetry. This is how you will do the and you will come to a conclusion. Then you will do X-ray pelvimetry. In this, what are the prognostic factors which are important for successful outcome? They are the size and shape of the pelvis, presentation and position of the head, the size of the head, molding of the head, and give way of the pelvis, and the force of uterine contractions. All the features will will decide how is the labor. All these features will indicate how the labor is progressing. So in this, only the X-ray pelvimetry can measure only the first point. That is, it is useful only in measuring the size and shape of the pelvis. In all the other factors, X-ray pelvimetry is not useful. The presentation position of the head, you can make out by clinical pelvimetry. Even the size, molding, give way of the pelvis, uterine contractions, everything are measured clinically. So it is useful. Of this, X-ray pelvimetry can identify only one factor, which is the size and the shape of the pelvis. Then what are the uses? In case of, it can also be used when there is any fractured pelvis, or if you want to measure any of the diameters. In that case, you can use the X-ray pelvimetry. And three views are taken, that is anteroposterior view, lateral, and the outlet view. But the most common view which we use is the lateral view. The lateral view is usually taken with the woman in erect posture, and then we look at the diameters. And what are the hazards of X-ray pelvimetry? The woman and the baby are exposed to radiation, which might prove. Next is the CT. What are the advantages of CT over X-ray pelvimetry? That in case of CT, there is less radiation exposure and it is easy to perform. Also, it is more accurate than X-ray in measuring the diameters of the pelvis. MRI is more accurate to assess the bony pelvis, And it is also used to assess the fetal size and maternal soft tissues in case we are facing dystocia. And there is no associated radiation risk, and it is biologically safe, MRI. And ultrasound is usually done to measure the fetal head, to know the diameter of the fetal head, and it is done usually in the intrapartum phase. Next is disproportion. What is actually cephalopelvic disproportion? Cephalopelvic disproportion is when the baby faces difficulty in negotiating the maternal pelvis, and if the baby is of average size and faces difficulty, then it is called as disproportion or cephalopelvic disproportion, CPD. What is the definition? The disparity in the relation between the head and the pelvis is called as cephalopelvic disproportion. And when do you have this cephalopelvic disproportion? Either the baby can be big, or in case if it is an average size baby, then the woman having a faulty pelvis. In any of the cases, you can have cephalopelvic disproportion. If there is an inlet contraction, that is when the obstetric conjugate is less than 10 centimeters, or the greatest transverse diameter is less than 12 centimeters, or when the diagonal conjugate is less than 12 centimeters, then you can call it as, see, cephalopelvic disproportion, there is always a disproportion. If the pelvis is faulty, then if the pelvis, that means if there is a contracted pelvis, you always face contraction only at the brim. The brim, usually you will face difficulty only, the head faces difficulty while negotiating the brim. Usually there is no mid-pelvic or outlet contraction, isolated mid-pelvic or outlet contraction. They are always associated with contraction at the brim. So in case there is a disproportion, then we look at the diameters of the inlet, that is the obstetric conjugate less than 10, or the greatest transverse diameter less than 12, or the diagonal conjugate less than 12. We conclude that there is an inlet contraction. An inlet contraction is can be associated with mid-pelvic contraction. When do you call it as mid-pelvic contraction? When the sum of the interischial spinous and posterior sagittal diameter is less than or equal to 13 centimeters. Normally, the bispinous diameter is 10 centimeters and the posterior sagittal diameter is 5 centimeters. So, normal diameter is usually 15 centimeters. The sum of bispinous and posterior sagittal diameter is usually 15. So, if it is less than or equal to 13, then we call it as mid-pelvic contraction. Next is, when do you call it as contracted outlet? That is when the interischial tuberous diameter is less than 8 centimeters. The interischial tuberous diameter is always 10 centimeters. If it is less than 8, then we call it as contracted outlet. And it is always, it can be associated with, outlet can be associated with mid-pelvic contraction. And when there is contraction at the outlet, then you can have perineal tears. And absence of CPD at the brim usually negates. It's present at the mid-pelvic plane. So, usually if there is a contraction in the mid-pelvic, then there is a contraction even in the brim. So finally, how do you, we have seen, we have taken history. Then how do you diagnose the cephalopelvic disproportion? Diagnosis always starts with taking history of the woman. What I have told you previously, that is you have to take the medical history of any of the diseases like rickets, osteomalacia, or any tuberculosis of the spine or the pelvic joints, or any polio in the past history, or any other injuries we can ask for. And then in obstetric history, you have to take any history of difficult labor in the previous delivery, what is the birth weight of the baby, and whether she had any difficult instrumental delivery which ended in death of the baby, or any early neonatal death, or if the baby has any neurological stigma. You have to find out all these things in the history. They will indicate that there is some problem in the previous delivery, that the woman had some problem in the pelvis, leading to CPD. The presence or degree of the cephalopelvic disproportion, we have to ascertain what is the degree of the cephalopelvic disproportion at the brim. Because since it is CPD is mainly at the brim, we have to ascertain what is the degree of the CPD by the following methods. Either you can ascertain by abdominal method or abdomino-vaginal method, which is called Muller-Munrocher method, or imaging pelvimetry, or you can do cephalometry, which is cephalometry includes ultrasound, MRI, and X-ray. So what is the clinical method? In the clinical method, in a multi-gravida, you have to inquire the previous history of spontaneous vaginal delivery of an average-sized baby, which will rule out disproportion. But in case of a primary gravida with no engagement of the head, even at the onset of labor, then you have to rule out disproportion in such cases. So in abdominal method, you have to ask the patient to empty her bladder, lie down in dorsal position with the thighs slightly flexed and separated, and you have to explain to her what you are doing. You have to take a consent from her, and now you have to grasp the head with your left hand like this. You will grasp the head of the baby with your left hand, and two fingers, the index and the middle finger of the right hand, are placed above the symphysis pubis, keeping the inner surface of the fingers in line with the, see, this is how, with his left hand is grasping the, with this hand, this he is grasping the head of the baby, and the right hand, the thumb and the index finger is placing on the symphysis pubis, just when the inner fingers in line with the symphysis pubis, in line with the anterior surface of the symphysis pubis, and we have to note whether there is any overlapping of the bones, parietal bones. And now with this abdominal hand, you have to push the baby into the pelvis. With the abdominal hand, you have to push the baby inside into the pelvis. So when the head is pushed downwards and backwards, then we have to note whether there is any overlapping of the bones. This can be used as a screening procedure in a routine OPD clinics. This is how you will do abdominal method. And now what are the inferences we get from that? When the head can be pushed down into the pelvis without any overlapping of the parietal bones on the symphysis pubis, it indicates that there is no disproportion and the pelvis is adequate. If the head can be pushed down a little, but there is slight overlapping of the parietal bones, that is, which is evidenced by the touch on the undersurface of the fingers, then it indicates moderate disproportion. If the head cannot be pushed down at all, and instead there is parietal bones overhang the symphysis pubis, displacing the fingers, then it indicates severe degree of disproportion. Next is the abdomino-vaginal method, which is the Muller-Munrocher method. Here, the patient is asked to empty her bowel by enema, and she is asked to empty her bladder before the procedure. She has to lie down in the dorsal with the thighs flexed, or she can be placed in lithotomy position, and internal examination should be done taking all aseptic precautions. The procedure has to be explained to the woman prior to doing the procedure, and consent has to be taken. Whatever you do to the patient, you have to explain and take the consent, which is very, very important. Now, how do you do this? This is how you do testing by abdomino-vaginal method or by manual examination, where the two fingers of the right hand are introduced into the vagina, and the fingertips should lie at the level of the ischial spines, and a thumb is placed over the symphysis pubis. Now the head of the baby is grasped with the left hand and is pushed downwards and backward direction into the pelvis. So this is how you will do. Now what are the inferences we get from this procedure? If the head can be pushed down to the level of the ischial spines with no overlapping of the parietal bones over the symphysis pubis, it will indicate that there is no disproportion. If the head can be pushed down a little but not up to the level of spines, and there is slight overlapping of the parietal bones, then there is moderate disproportion. And if the head cannot be pushed down, instead the parietal bones overhang the symphysis pubis, displacing the thumb, then it indicates there is severe degree of disproportion. This is how you will clinically establish the diagnosis of cephalopelvic disproportion. Now, your diagnosis can be supported by X-ray pelvimetry, and X-ray pelvimetry should be done only in severe cases, because there is a hazard of exposure of the woman and the baby to X-ray radiation. So lateral X-ray view is usually the preferred one, with the patient in standing position, and assessment of CPD is done in all planes of the pelvis. That is, all planes have to be assessed, the inlet, cavity and the outlet, and all the diameters have to be measured. Then what are the other methods? Other methods which we have seen are cephalometry, in which the size of the fetal head is estimated, especially the biparietal diameter, which is ideal to elicit because we have to be biparietal diameter is the one which will negotiate the brim and other cavity and the outlet of the pelvis. We have to see the relation of the biparietal diameter to all the planes of the given pelvis through which it has to pass. For this, we can either use ultrasound or MRI. And MRI is always a superior method for assessment, and also there is less biological risk. So now, depending on the clinical assessment, the X-ray pelvimetry and other imaging methods, we have diagnosed that woman is having cephalopelvic disproportion. Now we have to know what is the degree of disproportion and the contracted pelvis. We have to know because we have to plan her delivery. So we have to know whether she is having a severe disproportion, borderline, or moderate disproportion. When the obstetric conjugate is less than 7.5 centimeters, then it indicates it is severe degree of disproportion. In case of borderline disproportion, the obstetric conjugate is usually in between 9.5 to 10 centimeters. The anteroposterior diameter, it is less than 10 centimeters, and transverse diameter is less than 12 centimeters. Then we see there is contraction of the inlet, but it is not of severe degree, but borderline degree of disproportion at the inlet. I have told you that if there is a contraction, the contraction is usually at the brim. So we have to look at the diameters only of the brim. And in such cases, there is a borderline disproportion, the woman can usually go for normal vaginal delivery, but she has a high risk of dystocia of labor. Then what are the effects of contracted pelvis on pregnancy and labor? In pregnancy, there is incarceration of the retroverted gravid uterus in the flat pelvis. The abdomen is pendulous in case of multigravida with lax abdominal wall. So the uterine contractions are not adequately transferred to the fetus. Then there is a high degree of malpresentation. The risk of malpresentation is 3 to 4 times more during the pregnancy. And during labor, the course of events are decided by the degree of pelvic contraction and the presentation of the fetus. So what are the course of events which are decided by the degree of contraction? In case of borderline or moderate, you leave a woman for vaginal delivery, then you encounter that they have early rupture of membranes, there is increased incidence of cord prolapse, the cervical dilatation is slowed down, and increased tendency of prolonged labor, and in neglected cases, the woman may even go into obstructed labor with features of dehydration, ketoacidosis, and sometimes you even see sepsis. So there is increased incidence of operation, shock, PPH, and sepsis in such women. So there is also, because of the above things, there is increased chance of injury to the genital tract, which can either occur spontaneously or after a operative delivery. And what are the hazards to the fetus? Fetus will suffer from trauma and asphyxia. So these are all the difficulties during labor. Now how will you manage a contracted pelvis? What is the prerequisite for management of a contracted pelvis is you have to formulate what you have to do. So in case there is a contracted inlet, you have to know first, you have to assess what is the degree of disproportion by clinical method, and you have to take a support of imaging pelvimetry in case if it is needed, and you have to take into account whether the mother has any other associated complicating factors. What can be the other associated complicating factors? Like if she has a previous history of cesarean section, if she has preeclampsia, diabetes, any heart disease in this pregnancy, you have to take a history of all these things. And if the woman does not have any associated complicating factors and there is only a minor degree of contraction, then you can leave her to have a spontaneous vaginal delivery at term. So in case the woman has moderate to severe degree of disproportion, then they can be dealt by any one of the following things. You can either induce her before her expected date of delivery, which is preterm induction of labor, or you can do plan an elective cesarean section at term, depending on other comorbid conditions, or you can give her a trial labor. So in case you want to go for induction of labor before the date of delivery, expected date of delivery, then when do you have to exactly plan? In case of moderate degree of, see, mine induction of labor prior to date is only done in case of moderate degree of contraction. You cannot go in case of severe degree, you cannot do that. In moderate degrees of contraction, contracted pelvis, you can induce her 2 to 3 weeks prior to the expected date of delivery. Then a prior ultrasound has to be done to ascertain whether the fetus is of mature age or not. You have to assess the fetal maturity and you can induce her in case of moderate degree. And when is elective cesarean section done? It is usually done at term. And what are the indications? When there is a major degree of contracted inlet, or in case of moderate degree of inlet contraction associated with, when the moderate degree, where it is associated with either mid-pelvic or outlet contraction, you can go directly for cesarean. Or in case the woman is an elderly primey, any malpresentations like breech, then you can either go for directly cesarean section, or if it is a post-cesarean section, post-cesarean pregnancy, or if the woman has any medical complicating diseases like preeclampsia, diabetes, heart disease. In such cases also, you can directly plan an elective cesarean term. So when do you plan a trial of labor, or when do you give a trial of labor to the woman? What is the definition of trial labor? It is conduction of spontaneous labor in a moderate degree of cephalopelvic disproportion in an institution. That trial labor should take place only in any institution under supervision with watchful expectancy, hoping for a vaginal delivery. So these are all the terms which you have to use when you are describing a trial labor. That is, it has to take place in an institution under supervision with watchful expectancy, hoping for a vaginal delivery. This is called as trial labor. And aims of this are to avoid unnecessary cesarean and delivery of a healthy baby. What are the contraindications? Any associated mid-pelvic and outlet contraction, presence of any complicating factors which we have seen earlier, like elderly primey, previous cesarean, other medical illnesses, and also this has to take place only in an institution where facilities for cesarean section are available round the clock. 24 hours they have to be available. Otherwise, you cannot conduct a trial labor. Then how do you conduct a trial labor? For this, labor should be spontaneous in onset. Oral feeding is suspended and hydration is given by an IV drip. And progress of the labor has to be monitored. On a partogram, you have to chart a partogram and you have to look for progressive descent of the head and progressive dilatation of the cervix. And you have to monitor the maternal vitals like temperature, pulse, BP, respiratory rate. You have to make a chart of that. Not only that, you have to look for even the fetal health, like you have to monitor the fetal heart rate either with a cardiotocograph or fetal Doppler. If there is any failure in the progress, then augmentation, that is failure in the progress is if the uterine contractions are not, if you feel that the uterine contractions are not adequate, then you can augment the labor by either doing an amniotomy or by starting an oxytocin drip. But these have to be taken up only when the cervical dilatation is 3 or more than 3 centimeters. You should never do an amniotomy or put her on oxytocin before 3 centimeters. Then after the rupture of membranes, once you have ruptured the membranes, next, what do you have to do? You have to assess for cord prolapse, whether there is any cord, what is the color of the liquor. You have to once again do pelvic assessment. You have to see the condition of the cervix, and depending on all these factors, you have to make a decision whether you want to continue or you want to stop the trial labor. Then successful outcome, all the above factors, that if they do not have any of the following conditions and the labor is progressing smoothly with progressive cervical dilatation and maternal and fetal health are also normal, then you can continue and it will give you a successful outcome. Or what are the unfavorable features? If there is any cord prolapse, or if it is meconium Stein liquor, or if there is any difficulty once you have done a pelvic assessment again, if you find that it is very difficult for the head to negotiate the pelvis, or if the cervix is not dilating, there is arrest in dilatation of the cervix. These all are the unfavorable features, or if the force of uterine contractions are not adequate. These all are the unfavorable features, and you have to make a decision whether you need to continue the trial or stop it. So now there is what is the most important question in the trial labor? How long should a trial be continued? So for how much time should you continue this trial labor? So what do you, for how much, there is no time limit as to how long a trial is continued, but it is individualized to each case. While you chart the partogram and when you do all the above methods, like when you do a rupture of membrane, see all this, then you have to decide you can continue or not. So it is always individualized. Now, when do you call the progress is satisfactory? When there is adequate descent of the head, like the way you need it. Like, what is the normal descent of the head? It is 1 centimeter or 1 centimeter per hour in case of a primi and 2 centimeters in case of a multi. If the descent is adequate, when the progressive cervical dilatation, that is 1 centimeters per hour in case of primi and multi, that is the progressive cervical dilatation. If it is there and maternal and fetal conditions are good, then it indicates that labor is progressing smoothly. Now, how do you terminate? In case you see an unsuccessful, unfavorable factors, then how do you terminate a trial labor? That is, it can either be if all the above factors are normal, then it can end with spontaneous delivery with or without episiotomy, or you can do an instrumental delivery with either forceps or ventouse, or if you think the trial is not progressing properly, you can go for C-section. These are the methods in which a trial labor is terminated. So when do you call it a successful trial? When there is birth of a healthy baby vaginally, either spontaneously or by using forceps or ventouse, with the maternal condition being good. Then you call that the trial is successful. Baby should be healthy, mother should be healthy, and it has to be vaginal delivery. It can either be spontaneous or it can be instrumental. Either you can use a forceps or a ventouse, but baby and mother should be in good condition. Then you call it a successful trial. If the delivery happens by cesarean, or you deliver a dead baby spontaneously, or you resort to craniotomy, then it indicates that the trial has failed. So in the next pregnancy, you should never go for a trial. You should decide for a elective cesarean and plan accordingly. Now, what is mid-pelvic and outlet contraction? In mid-pelvic and outlet contraction in isolated cases, they are very rare. So, clinical diagnosis is only made after descent of head in the pelvis. What we have seen is contraction at the inlet and trial labor and everything CPD we have discussed is all at the contraction at the brim. So now we will see what happens when there is mid-pelvic and outlet contraction. Isolated cases of mid-pelvic or outlet contraction are rare. We have seen that contraction is only at the brim mainly. And mid-pelvic or outlet are also associated with contraction at the brim. Now, how will you clinically diagnose? Since there is no contraction at the brim, in case it is an isolated case,